Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. You know, we're so often encouraged to think that the global economy is some sort of force of nature that we have no control over and you can't possibly understand unless you're an economist, and you know, certainly can't have any influence over. My name is Elizabeth Swagger, and I'm the Assistant Director with Oregon Fair Trade Campaign. We're a statewide coalition of labor, environmental, and human rights organizations. The Trans-Pacific FTA is currently being negotiated between 12 different countries. It's the U.S., Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and Peru. But there's also bilateral negotiations taking place so that Canada, Japan, and Mexico can also join, which means that other countries can join on over time after it passes. So theoretically, negotiations have been underway on this deal since 2010, but so far none of the text has been officially released. In fact, the U.S. Forced countries to sign a document swearing that they would not release any of the negotiating documents until at least 5 years after the negotiations were over. Interim dealing is completely outrageous. It doesn't benefit anyone but the people who are at the top, who are able to have access to negotiators. While you and I are barred from reviewing these negotiating documents, approximately 600 corporate lobbyists are acting as official advisors, which means that they not only have access to the negotiating documents, but also the negotiators. So it's not unreasonable to assume that corporations are literally writing these texts. We've gotten from conversations with negotiators, with lobbyists, and from a small handful of texts that have been leaked. What we know about the U.S. proposals for labor standards in the Trans-Pacific FTA is that they're essentially the same as what we got under George W. Bush. This makes it much easier for manufacturers to lower wages and conditions in China, and you know, they may outright just shift their production to cheaper manufacturing countries like Vietnam. And even if you're a firefighter or a home care worker, this still impacts you because it puts pressure on wages, downward pressure on wages, and that's across all industries. It also creates competition from an ever-growing pool of unemployed workers whose jobs have been offshored. And of course, those manufacturing jobs, you know, service jobs that we lose, result in less tax revenue, so there's less money for public services like firefighting, public health, education, libraries, you name it. The little text that has been leaked has been around intellectual property rights. So when I talk about intellectual property rights, you might think of like Hollywood, and certainly there's parts of the Trans-Pacific FTA that anyone opposed to SOPA would go back to their closets and bring out their rally signs again. But one of the proposals that has been leaked and has been studied in depth on intellectual property has to do with pharmaceuticals. The drug companies want to use this trade deal to both actually and effectively lengthen the term of patents around the world. In Vietnam, this is essentially a death sentence for the people who are struggling with HIV or tuberculosis or other life-threatening diseases that would be manageable with access to medication. The U.S. is pushing for investment provisions that would allow oil companies, or really any other industry for that matter, to challenge virtually any law, regulation, or even court decision that negatively affects cross-border trade or even cross-border investments. That means that any environmental law, land use law, or consumer safety law that influences trade or investment can be challenged in an international tribunal that completely circumvents our local domestic judicial system. Under the WTO, the U.S. has already lost 90% of the 65 cases brought against it. This has resulted in weakening portions of the Clean Air Act, of the Endangered Species Act, and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. The difference between the WTO and the Trans-Pacific Free Trade Agreement is that the WTO allows countries to bring forth challenges. But the U.S. has been pushing for the Trans-Pacific FTA to allow individual corporations to issue challenges, a tool for corporations to put powers into their own hands at the expense of local sovereignty and community sovereignty. Negotiated behind closed doors, we're definitely not going to have a good chance of stopping this. So if we are going to stop this in its tracks, we need to bring it to the light of day. This is something that we need to start speaking to our elected officials about now. So if we're going to derail this thing, or less likely get a fair deal out of this thing, we need to engage now. And that has to happen before these negotiations are over. We can get started by, letting our elected officials, know that we want them to make certain demands. And if our elected officials are making demands of negotiators, whether that's on labor standards or financial regulations, environmental protections, or drug patents, or what have you, there's events like this happening all throughout the state. In fact, we are doing a total of 6 in our Trade Justice Roadshow. And then there's events happening all throughout the country and all throughout the Pacific Rim. People are learning and getting active, and that's happening particularly in a lot of other countries. Already in Japan, something like 10% of the country has signed a petition opposing this free trade agreement. And they've only been at this for a month, so that's really